Halo Effect by Alex51324. Chapter 8. Epilogue.
Here you are, gents. The honeymoon suite, the publican said grandly, opening the door.
It wasn't, of course. By ordinary standards, it wasn't even much of a room. Small, tucked up under the eaves, with a sloping ceiling. The sole window looked out on the courtyard where the dustbins were kept, and the wallpaper was both eye-wateringly garish and inexpertly hung. But it had a door that locked and, most importantly, a double bed with a clean, if worn, spread and 2 pillows. That alone made it by far the nicest room that Thomas and Peter had ever shared, and the publican, or someone, had made an effort to brighten the place up a bit with a vase of flowers on the table by the window.
Perfect,
said Peter. Once the publican had left, Thomas dropped his valise on the floor and flopped backwards onto the bed. The train ride had been much longer than it should have been. They kept being shunted onto sidings while troop trains went past. And then he'd been on his feet since Coventry, when a little old farm woman had shoved her way into the already packed third-class car loaded with parcels. Thomas had waited in vain for somebody else to get up. Perhaps the 2 strapping lads in Kitchener Blues, who were 2 seats ahead of him. But no one had, and he'd eventually had to give her his own seat. She'd thanked him loudly, projecting her voice toward the 2 strapping lads, if he wasn't mistaken, and then proceeded to talk his ear off about her boy in the army for the rest of the journey. The bundles were his laundry, apparently.
Tired? Peter asked, laying down beside him.
Not too tired, Peter said, rolling over and kissing him thoroughly. It didn't seem a good idea to complain about standing on a train for a couple of hours when Peter's letters described all-day marches. After only a few minutes of the slow, lazy necking that Thomas loved, he moved things along, sitting up and throwing one leg over Peter to straddle his hips.
"We're doing this now?" Peter asked, taking him down for another kiss.
"Not complaining," he added.
"I just wondered."
"I reckon if we pace ourselves, we can do this half a dozen times before I have to go back," Thomas explained, kissing him again. "Maybe 7 or 8 if we wake up early." They were going to wake up together. Twice! After having slept beside each other all night long. It was almost too thrilling for words.
"I see," said Peter.
"I'm at your disposal."
"You're lovely like that,"
Peter said as Thomas was cleaning them up later.
"What?"
Thomas asked. "Sticky?"
Satisfied.
"Ah!"
They kissed some more, and Peter said, "I'll last longer next time."
"Yeah?"
"Yeah.
Turns out it's pretty hard to find a minute for self-abuse when you're sleeping in a tent with 49 other blokes."
Thomas hadn't thought about that.
"Probably a bit worse for the regular blokes, though," he pointed out. "I mean, self-abuse is pretty much their only option."
"The ones with wives get weekend passes sometimes," Peter said.
"Anyway, we haven't talked about whether we're going to, be true to each other for the duration."
"Of course we're going to be true," Thomas said.
"But I don't know that has anything to do with whether or not we have it off with other people." Of course, he'd have rather been with Peter than anyone else. But he'd have rather eaten every meal with him, too, and that didn't mean he was going to starve himself to death. But if it was important to Peter that he didn't, he supposed he wouldn't.
"I'm not bothered either way. Whatever you want."
He thought of something else.
"Only don't go doing anything risky. I don't know what they do to you in the army if they catch you at that sort of thing."
"It can't be much worse than what they do everywhere else," Peter said, "considering the stories Eddie and Joey tell, and what that lot get up to in Hyde Park every night of the week." Thomas was obscurely relieved to hear Peter referring to the regimental queers as that lot. Technically, he supposed Peter was one of that lot now, for the duration.
"But I won't do anything risky," Peter went on.
He poked Thomas in the side. "You either. We know what they do to you for it here."
"All right,"
Thomas agreed. With that decided, they moved on to talking about what to do about dinner.
"They do food here,"
Peter said,
"but it isn't much to write home about. There's a hotel a few streets over that's supposed to have a nice dining room."
"How nice?" Thomas asked. If it was too nice, the likes of them wouldn't be let in.
"Medium nice. Some of the blokes take their wives there if they come down for a visit. Your suit should be all right, and they let you in anywhere in a uniform these days."
Thomas wondered if Peter had asked the blokes on purpose what sort of places they took their wives. After a bit more cuddling, they got up and pulled themselves together, then went out. It was a pretty town, and they decided to stroll for a bit before dinner. There were plenty of other people doing the same thing. Mostly couples, most of the men in uniform. "Fritz! Hey, Fritz!" someone called from across the street. Peter turned and looked. "Hi, Jer." "Come meet my wife," Jer said, gesturing to the woman beside him. He was holding a small child. They crossed the street. "Viv, this is Fitzroy from my section," Jer said. "And my brother Thomas," Peter said. He supposed it was as good an explanation as any. "And this must be Jerry Jr., Peter added, indicating the child that Jer held. "He is," Jer confirmed. "Can you say hello to Dada's friend?" The child burbled something. "Jerry's written so much about you, I feel like I know you," Viv said to Peter. "I'm so glad they're sending you all together. It makes me feel a bit better about the whole thing." "Me too," Peter said. It wasn't very funny, but all four of them laughed. Thomas supposed that Viv had to be feeling the same way he did, turning anxiety, papered over with the need to make this time as happy and normal as possible, just in case. He supposed that neither of them would have acknowledged it, even if he wasn't supposed to be Peter's brother. "We're going to dinner," Viv said, looking inquiringly at her husband. "Should we all—" "Oh, God, no!" The last thing Thomas wanted was to waste any of his precious time with Peter making stilted conversation with total strangers. But he couldn't say that, could he? Peter, naturally, knew how to say it. "Thank you, but I'm sure you and Jer have a lot to say to each other. We won't intrude." Viv looked as relieved as Thomas felt. "All right, then. It was good to meet you both." They went their separate ways. "I've mentioned Jer, haven't I?" Peter said as they continued their walk. Thomas nodded. "You had to be friends because he's called Jerry and you're almost called Fritz." Peter had explained it in one of his letters. "Right," Peter said. "Army humor is a little broad, I've found." They walked on a bit. "You're my half-brother, by the way," Peter added. "Different fathers." So they wouldn't have to pretend Thomas's surname was Fitzroy, too. "All right. But I think most of my chums have gone home for their leaves. Jer's wife moved back in with her mother for the duration. I expect she came here rather than the other way round so they could have some privacy." For pretty much the same thing that he and Peter wanted privacy for, Thomas figured. "I see." At the hotel dining room, when they were looking over the menus, Peter said, "Listen, about that brother thing." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "I put that on the forms they had us fill out, too, so they know who to send the telegram to if anything happens they need to send a telegram about." "Oh, good," Thomas said quickly. "I was worried about that. It took so long to hear about Eddie, and—" "Yeah," Peter said. "That's why I did it. And, I put your name on my post office savings account. Not that there's much in it, but, well." Thomas nodded, feeling a little numb. "And I wrote to our butler at Sir H's house that you might call for my things at the end of the war if I wasn't able to. You don't have to. It's just my clothes and some books and things like that. But he said they just hang on to everything until they heard from you. If he died." If Peter was dead, would Thomas want to go to London and collect his trunk? Would Peter's collars and shoes and whatever else be precious relics or unwelcome reminders? "All right," he said. "That's all," Peter said, aiming for a cheerful tone and missing by a mile. I mean, more likely than not everything will be all right, but I wanted you to know how I arrange things just in case." "I understand. Good idea. Hope for the best, but plan for the worst." "Right, that's what I thought. Should we get some wine? I'll treat. I've barely had to buy my own cigarettes the whole time I've been here." That lightened the mood a bit, and for the rest of dinner they talked of ordinary things. News they'd heard from their friends, Downton gossip, Peter's battalion's preparations for embarkation. "Theo and Syl signed up for one of those new PALS battalions," Peter said. "Have you heard about those?" Thomas nodded. Men who signed up together, from the same village or school or trade, were promised they'd be trained and shipped off together. "They haven't got one for our sort, have they?" "For London servants they have," Peter said. "But no, not otherwise." Too bad, Thomas said. We could call it the London Peculiars. They both laughed a little more than the joke deserved. The waiter was being noticeably generous when he refilled their wine glasses, likely in deference to Peter's uniform. You might almost be able to talk me into joining up if it was like that, Thomas added. It would almost be like the imaginary pub, except with getting shot at. Somebody, the stuff I used to know, told me the ancient Greeks had a battalion like that, Peter informed him. Of course they did! Everyone knew about the ancient Greeks. So it was called the Sacred Band of something or other. The idea was that they'd fight harder, to protect each other. They were all couples and they took vows like they were married. Oh, all right. Sign me up then. The imaginary pub, with being married, might be worth getting shot at for. Well, first we have to move to ancient Greece, Peter said. Damn, there's always a catch. Later, when their meals had arrived, Peter said, Rumor has it we're taking our tents with us, so do me a favor and pray it doesn't rain Sunday night. Thomas nodded, chewing on a particularly tough bit of beef. All right. How come? He asked once he had swallowed. Rumor also has it that's our last night, Peter explained. Everyone has to be back by Sunday morning anyway, and they say the usual thing is to load up all your gear the day before and leave first thing in the morning. So what, you just sleep on the ground? Thomas supposed worse things happened in war, but it seemed a bit rough for their last night in England. I suppose, Peter shrugged. It was one of the sergeants who said, but he might have been pulling our legs. Well, bugger me, Thomas said. If you like, Peter said cheekily. Later, when they went back in their room above the pub, Peter did. Thomas hadn't done that for a while, not since Philip, and he hadn't liked it much the way that Philip did it, but with Peter it was different. Of course it was. Peter kissed him while he did it and held him and called him dearest. Afterwards, Thomas lay with his head on Peter's chest the way they had done under the tree in Yorkshire. This time they didn't have to get up and fix their clothes before anyone saw them. Thomas fell asleep like that, with Peter's hands slowly rubbing his back. In the morning they woke up in each other's arms and made love again and dozed the morning away, waking up just in time for another round. They once were over there, the officers look at our letters. Uh-huh, Thomas said sleepily. To censor it, Maud had explained the principle in detail. We'll have to be careful. Yeah, Peter said, kissing him. I mean, there is a way. I could write how much I miss your delicious lips. He interlaced his fingers with Thomas's. Your exquisite hands. His free hands slipped under the sheets that covered them. Your perfect sculpted bottom. What's that? Thomas had a feeling he knew. He hoped they weren't going to have an argument about it. Well, they told us... they actually said in so many words, not to worry about it if we wanted to write steamy letters to our sweethearts. They're just looking for things like place names, numbers of troops. They don't care what else you say. He took a deep breath. I just have to write a girl's name at the top. Yeah, that was it. What name did you have in mind? Teresa. That way when I address the envelope, I can write TH and then just sort of a squiggle. Thomas tried to imagine opening a letter from Peter and reading Dear Teresa at the top. It would feel like Peter was writing to someone else. I'd rather you didn't, he said. If you have to, I guess, but we're pretty good at saying what we want to say in a way nobody else will notice, right? I'd rather do it that way. All right, Peter said. It's just something I thought of. If there's something you really have to say, Thomas added, but not usually, all right? Peter nodded. Good idea, that's what we'll do. And they don't read our letters coming in, so that part's no different from how it always is. If there's something you have to say, just write it on a separate piece of paper and I'll not keep it lying around. He brought Thomas's hand up to his lips and kissed it. I'll want to keep your letters, usually. The rest of the day, which had seemed so long and luxurious when Thomas had been thinking about it, sped by. They took a bus over to the next village, where the camp was, and Peter showed Thomas all of the things he'd mentioned in his letters, including the infamous tent. It was actually a little better than Thomas had pictured, tall enough to stand up in, with a tin stove at one end and a wooden floor. It has a floor, he pointed out. If it didn't, Peter said grimly, they couldn't make us polish it every other minute. Do you take the floor with you when you move it? I have no idea, Peter answered. Maybe it comes up in sections. There was also the YMCA canteen where sweets and cigarettes could be bought, and the parade ground where a new set of recruits who had come in a week or two ago were trying to remember what port arms and so forth meant. After seeing the camp, they got a picnic tea from a shop and ate it on the riverbank. It was a fairly chilly day for September, but there were a number of other people determinedly trying to enjoy it, having picnics of their own, or poling down the river on the flat boats the toughs called punts. Most of the men were in uniform, and the ones that weren't looked embarrassed. There was also quite a bit of evident confusion over whether or not you were supposed to salute an officer if he was punting past you with his girlfriend, and how long you had to keep doing it if you did, but he didn't notice. All in all, it was something of a relief to get back to their pub. They had a drink in the main bar, then went up to their room, where Peter sucked Thomas off. Not one of Thomas's favorites, but Peter liked doing it. That's 5, Peter pointed out once he'd finished. I think we're on pace for 7 or 8. After supper and a couple of pints, they managed number 6, which was the reverse of what they'd done the night before. Thomas was even rustier at that side of things, but he tried to do it the way Peter had, tender-like, and it seemed to work out all right. Afterward, they cuddled up and shared a cigarette. Their time together was really almost over now. Just the night, which they'd spend asleep, and then all the rest of it, they'd be watching the clock. Thomas wasn't getting a particularly early train. If he ended up sitting for hours on a siding while troop trains rattled past and then had to sleep in the yard, so be it. But still, the moment of parting would be looming over them. What? Thomas asked as they passed the cigarette between them. What's going to happen after the war? You fixed up everything you can before it goes badly. But suppose everything goes as it should and you come home safe and sound. What do we do then? It didn't seem right that they would go back to what they had talked about the night after Q, trying to see each other when they could. Not after all that had already happened and all that was to come. Not when all those other couples they had seen today had something real to look forward to hope for. I don't know, love, said Peter. Maybe something will be different, somehow. Maybe we can get that cottage. Keep house together. Don't, said Thomas. He didn't want lies. What can we really do? All right, Peter said, and thought for a moment. What if we get jobs in the same house? I'd be a footman again if I had to. Or butler and second man in a smaller house. Or maybe I'll learn to drive over there and I can be a chauffeur when I get back. Chauffeurs get cottages. Now that was a real possibility. They probably need people to drive ambulances. Yeah, Peter said. I bet they do. That was better. It was something like a plan. Most of it was out of their hands, whether it could ever come true or not, but it was something to hold on to. You'd be good as a chauffeur, he said, though there was no particular reason he thought so, except that Peter was good in general. And I could pop over to your cottage as often as we wanted, now we're officially brothers. Peter nodded. See, the war's lucky for us in one way already. Otherwise, you'd never get asked to write down on an official piece of paper who your family is. Well, there was one time you were, when you were starting a new one. Getting married. You ought to be able to, he said. If you don't have a real one, you should be able to just say. They finished the cigarette, and he reached for a new one. Oh, hey, that reminds me, I accidentally picked up a new sister. How's that? Peter asked. Well, you know the whole bait situation with his wife and how Joey thought he'd probably beat her? Peter nodded. But he says he didn't. Yeah, and Anna believes him. So I asked if she had any brothers, in case he needed his ass kicking. She doesn't, so I said something about how I guess I'd have to do it if he did, and for some reason she thought that meant I saw her as a sister, Thomas explained. Peter laughed, choking a little on cigarette smoke. Yeah, I can't imagine how she made that mistake. Anyway, I couldn't just tell her she got it wrong. That would be mean. It would, Peter agreed, still smiling. No, I think that's good. It's not so bad going to France if I'm not leaving you entirely on your own. Thomas hadn't really thought of it that way. Who's going to look out for you then? He asked. Oh, my chums in the section, Peter answered. Jer and a few others. I'll do all right. Peter did seem to make friends as easily as Thomas made enemies. They fell asleep not long after that, although Thomas didn't really want to. He wanted to store up every minute of this, of lying next to Peter in the dark, talking and smoking. Enough of it to last them the whole war. They ended up sleeping late the next morning, and so only had time to make love once more. After that, they took a walk through the town, had a bit of lunch, and then back to the room to collect their things and make sure they hadn't left anything the chambermaid would ask questions about. Taking one last look around, Thomas felt a sharp pang of loss, like when he'd left home after his mother died, or when he'd left London for Downton. For a couple of days, they'd made this place into a sort of home, hadn't they? We should come back here, he said, after the war. That was real. That was something they could just about manage to make happen as long as Peter wasn't killed. All right, Peter said. It's a date. They kissed one last time and left. The walk to the station was quiet, their arms brushing against one another now and then. Thomas half hoped that the train would be delayed. He really didn't care how late he got back if it meant he could sit in the station cafe with Peter. But it wasn't, of course. The board said it was right on time, and there were plenty of other people already queued up for it. He sprang for a second-class ticket. He'd be glad of it if they did end up sitting on a siding for hours again. On the platform, Peter embraced him. Brothers could do that just about if one of them was going off to war, and shook his hand ardently. Be all right, he said. Whatever happens, be all right. Promise. I promise, Thomas said, and the train whistle blew. He got onto the train with seconds to spare and tumbled into the first compartment he saw on the platform side of the train that had an empty place. The window was already occupied by a young girl with pigtails and school uniform who was leaning out of it and waving her handkerchief. Thomas shoved in beside her and waved too. When the platform had shrunk into the distance, they pulled themselves back into the compartment. One of the other occupants, a severe-looking older woman, was looking at them with evident disapproval, but didn't say anything, so Thomas guessed that she was not in charge of the child. She also didn't appear to belong to any of the three businessmen seated opposite. With a mental shrug, he took the empty seat between the woman and the girl. The girl took out a bag of sweets and offered him one. He could just tell that the woman was the sort to say, yes, as a matter of fact, I do, if he asked if she minded if he smoked, so he accepted. My brother's going off to the war, she informed him, sweet stuffed into one cheek. So is mine, he said, performing the same maneuver. We have to be very brave, so that they can be brave too and not worry about us. You're right, said Thomas. That's exactly what we have to do. For as long as it takes, the girl added. As long as it takes, he echoed. End of Halo Effect by Alex51324. If you enjoyed this recording of the content, feel free to leave a comment below or a review at the original story from the link in the descriptions. Thank you for listening.